Load off from your busy workday and listen to the dulcet tunes of our guests, who are all over the cybersecurity landscape. We're going to ask them some hard questions, not going to lie, probably some softballs too. But no matter what, it's going to be a good time. So sit back, pour yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, or something stronger if it's that time of day, and enjoy Coffee Talk with Serge. Hi, I'm Ryan Kovar, and I'm here with my very good friend, sometimes, Rick Holland, who I will ask to introduce himself very shortly. As always, you're in Coffee Talk with Serge, and today we're doing an interview series with Rick. He has a fascinating background. I first learned about Rick back when he was an analyst at Forrester, and then fell in love with him on main stage at SANS Threat Intelligence Summit. We've been best friends ever since, at least one way. I don't know about Rick's feelings to me, but Rick, welcome. Thank you for coming.
It's good to be on, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
So, Rick, we're going to talk for about 25, 35, 45 minutes. We'll see where the spirit takes us for this day, the cyber spirit, if you will. But I'd love for you to kind of just introduce yourself, your background, and how you got to be where you are today.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned our relationship came through SANS, but right now I'm currently a CISO at ReliaQuest. I'm in the office of the CISO, but I came in through acquisition. I was a CISO at Digital Shadows, which is a threat intelligence digital risk protection company, which is, how I kind of made my way into SANS. When I was at Forrester Research, I established the threat intel research line that was there, got involved with SANS, ultimately led to Digital Shadows. And prior to Forrester, I'd done jobs as incident response in university here in DFW, had help desk roles, that sort of stuff. And then I was in Army intelligence straight out of high school.
Very exciting. We share that experience of going into the military and then entering cyber later on. I, of course, made the wiser choice of joining the Navy, but not all of us have the ASVAB skills to qualify. So
there's a good
thank
joke.
you for your service, Rick.
There's a good joke for maybe 40% of our audience.
There we go. Rick, one of the things I love about your career is kind of your transition into leadership. And you were very kind when we wrote a book recently, Bluenomicon. You, of course, are one of the key authors that we asked. I think you follow right after Wendy Nather, which is pretty solid.
It's a tough act to follow. Very tough.
It's a tough act to follow. The queen of cyber, the grande dame of all CISOs. Can you kind of go over what you talked about?
Security poverty line.
Oh, security poverty lines. That's true.
She's come up with of many bright things that Wendy has done.
So fun story. We have credited you for that for like 2 years on this show, I think.
Oh, really?
Misattribution.
Oh no.
I don't blame you on that one. It's a brilliant piece of work. You just attributed her, but yeah, we say security poverty line often, and we say, as our good friend of the show, Rick Holland would say. Now I have to say, it's Rick Holland took credit for.
That is false narrative. Fake news.
False narrative. What did you to give the people a little bit of what did you write about today, or what did you write about in Bluenomicon about leadership?
I think one of the main themes that I wrote about was trying to be more effective leaders. And when you look in the CISO ranks, or when you look in the security leadership ranks, if you're a director or a senior manager, whatever the case may be, I think organizations or individuals within organizations are kind of struggling to speak and grow up the chain of command. And many years ago, I wrote an article in Dark Reading where I talked about big C CISOs and little c CISOs. And really, I was kind of building on that as I wrote that. And you have a lot of folks that still, unfortunately, will talk in terms of vulnerabilities and IOCs and a lot of things that are operationally important to us as security practitioners, but they're not what you want to communicate as you're trying to get your 2024 budget. So I was really focused on, how do you transition from a little C to a big C? We just went through the pandemic and we saw business challenges there. And of course, right now, we're seeing business challenges in particular in the cybersecurity space and the technology space with the layoffs that we see there. So it's an important thing that we do need to be able to speak the language of the business. So it helps with our programs. It helps us retain staff, right? Maybe we can avoid layoffs if we speak better. So it's really an important thing for any security leader to have.
I find the question about metrics to be one of the most fascinating parts of that change as you progress from an individual contributor or a leader of individual contributors into an executive role or a CISO. And one of the things I constantly ask CISO friends of mine is, what are the metrics of success that you look for? And two of the things I've learned there is, one, everyone has a different answer. And two, when I say that, it depends on if you're referring to what their measures of success are or what their board of directors measure of success are, because the two aren't always the same. So I'm going to start off with the first. Like, Rick, if you're running a CISO program, for you personally, what are the metrics of success that you're looking for that indicate you have a healthy, vibrant security program at your company?
Well, I mean, generally, I think the answer depends on what your vertical is. So the way I would
Ooh.
speak would be with, my experience in the verticals of being a CISO at a cybersecurity company. Cybersecurity companies' jobs are to push product or services or a bit of both, depending on what they are. So the way I think about it is mileage is going to vary. So I'm going to answer your question in kind of two ways. One is there's a lot of measurements for success that I think apply no matter what your vertical is. And then depending on your vertical, there'll be distinct things for you if you're in finance or if you're in retail, e-commerce, whatever the case may be. I think some of the important measures of success or things that boards are interested in is like, do you have a framework that you're using? NIST cybersecurity framework, ISO 27001, insert your maturity model there. What is the framework that's guiding our program? And are we trending up or trending down? Boards in particular and communicating up the chain of command, they're very interested in the trends that are there. And I think even if we could argue about what framework you use or what metrics you use, a snapshot quarter over quarter and a consistent framework you're using shows progress up, progress down. So I think that's good. So for example, for me specifically, I would use a combination of ISO 27001 and the NIST cybersecurity framework to kind of represent the maturity of the program. And this is the snapshot. There's a joke I have for those that have watched Office Space, which is a lot of us in our place. Like, the Bobs come in and say, what would you say you do here? I think it's really important when you're looking at metrics of where you started and where you are and then where you're headed. And so you can give a snapshot if you're doing a quarterly. The way I had done it, I would present to the risk committee frequently, and then I have one annual presentation to the board of directors. And so I would just show the progress over the past year. Here's where we started. We implemented these new tools, EDR. They were attached to this particular risk, and we've now solved that, and we moved on to other things. So I think having metrics that you can trend there are helpful. I think boards want to know, what governance do you have? So talking about your governance, talking about findings that you might have. So I did use metrics around ISO and what were my major nonconform. I never had a major, but minor nonconformities, observations, that sort of stuff, and progress that you have there. I would try to tie it to initiatives as well. So, hey, we have a significant product launch that's going out. This is how we try to secure that new launch. Or at one point we launched into a new region. We got up to speed on the threat landscape for the region, that sort of stuff. So I think largely having a framework, showing trends there is useful, making the leadership feel comfortable in the governance model that you have in your security program, that you're not just type of thing. You can make that into a video there if
Pew,
you
pew,
want.
pew, pew,
That's probably a pretty good one.
cyber bullets. That's
Are all
totally going to be
helpful
a
things to
gift
do.
by the end of this.
Yeah, you can definitely make it into that. And, one metric that I used, and I see it a lot in my day job now, is, there's people like the funnels. And so what I would use is like, here's my observations on the network. These are actual incidents, true positives, that sort of stuff. And especially if you're using a third party to help you do it, like you're funneling out the noise, it's justifying the investment that you have. So you will have metrics based on service providers you have as well.
Do you find that, as you said, it depends on the vertical. So obviously in a cybersecurity vertical, you may have board of directors or C-level peers who are more informed around cyber than others. Do you have any thoughts around if you didn't work, for example, if you worked in the airline industry or if you worked in pharmaceuticals, do you feel like you'd have the same metrics that you would be proposing to the board or conversations, or more educational back and forth?
Well, I think no matter what you do, whoever your board members are, or even internal leadership that you're having, you should try to have a champion or try to find someone out. So when I first started presenting, like I would talk to a handful of the board members in advance of any conversation. I try to understand the dynamics that are in the room, what's important to the board, what are they interested in, those sorts of things. So you're not going in cold, like you are prepared, even socializing things that you want to talk about. maybe you're talking about an intrusion that you've had or something like that. It's not the first time something is heard at the board writ large at that particular piece. I mean, certainly if you're in the financial industry, there's going to be certain very different things that people are interested in there than you would in a technology company that's out there. I also wouldn't make an assumption, and I found this myself, that just because you work in a technology company that your board members are going to be proficient in what you do as well. So I think it's important to find out what's important to the board, what's driving their particular success in the vertical that you're at. I actually write a little bit about some of the business stuff in the book as well for publicly traded companies. And you've heard me talk about this at the SANS conference for years. It's looking at the SEC Form 10Ks. Well, it's not just that, it's the 10Ks, it's the quarterly earnings reports and the annual reports. If you want to understand how your business operates, it's a good cheat sheet for it. And then you can have an informed conversation with a line of, if you're at a financial institution, you can talk to a line of business leader, but you've read the financial report, you've read the Form 10K, which outlines the risks. There's an enterprise risk function in these companies. Even if you're a private company, you're going to have a risk function and a risk committee. You can identify the risks that are most important. Then you can start deconstructing those risks. Okay, what are the risks to people, process, and technology associated with this very important revenue stream for the company? Then you can start to look at how might I form metrics that will do this. A lot of them will be operational metrics, like how many vulnerabilities are in this platform, that sort of stuff. And then you could take that into a story to communicate up to the board. But you definitely don't want to throw a lot of cybersecurity operational metrics at most boards that are out there.
Now, have you traditionally reported in the CEO, the CFO, the CTO, CRO? Where do you find as a CISO that you report into?
I report into this to the CEO, but again, I think it depends on the vertical that you're in. Also, maturity. I think a typical, you've probably seen this as well. It doesn't mean it can't work at all, but if you see security reporting into IT, that's typically indicative of a less mature function because some of the conflicts of interest between the availability that an IT team needs versus the other components that are out there. But it can work. I'm sure folks that have reported to CIOs that's been successful. I think one of the risks when I worked in university, we reported into the president, and you can see if you report into a CEO, whoever you report into needs to have the time to be able to manage the function. And so you could report into a chief legal officer, and if that legal officer doesn't have the time or sometimes the understanding, you may not be successful there either.
One of the talks I actually saw at Black Hat, one of the best talks I saw by far, was by two lawyers who were discussing the implications of the changing legal world of being a CISO. And part of the issues, of course, like the jokes are rife about CISOs, right? Like they're just the scapegoats. The average tenure for a CISO is something like 18 to 30 months or something like that. They're often the people who are asked to fall on the sword. You alluded to this earlier with the little C versus big C. I think there's been very much a case where the chief information security officer is not necessarily respected the same way a chief financial officer is. But we are now seeing a turn of events where CISOs are being prosecuted or they're being fined because of the actions of a company or because obviously of their own actions. But one of the things I found really fascinating was this concept of there is director and officer insurance for a company.
Do you know?
And this has to do with personal, for those who don't know, this is insurance policies that a company takes out, and they can actually assist for the personal, basically the personal lawyers or consultation for officers of the company, or if the company is being sued or otherwise. And I'm fascinated by this because originally, apparently, CISOs are not part of this because they were not necessarily the big C, but now it's starting to come up to one. I'm curious to you, as your career has moved over, you've obviously advised other people. What are those big changes you're seeing for a CISO from a personal point of view of like, hey, you need to be careful of this because you may be personally liable, not just your company. Have you seen that change? Have you experienced that? Or?
Well, definitely. I guess one thing I would say is I don't know if any of Joe Sullivan's talks from summer camp are publicly available. I know he presented at DEF CON, or perhaps he shared his content. I had
Joe Sullivan is the Uber CISO who was prosecuted, correct, for those who don't know.
That's correct. He presented at the CISO summit for Black Hat, which I was able to attend. And that was Chatham House rules, but I think a lot of his stuff he's put out publicly with respect to that case. And then, of course, we have SolarWinds has been notified that they're under investigation, both current and former executives, CFO, CISO as another one there. So certainly between these two cases, in the CISO communities that I'm in now, and anytime a CISO is looking at a new role, this question needs to be asked. Like, what are the liabilities here? How are you going to protect me? Those sorts of things. I don't know if anyone's done any studies on it as far as, and maybe some of the CISO recruiting firms, Hitch Partners perhaps might have done something here where they're surveying like how many people actually are able to take on D&O insurance and some of those things. I think it's probably a smaller amount and it's going to be trending up, and it may also be size of job. I think if you're a smaller company, you're probably less likely than you are to be entertained at a larger organization.
I find this interesting partly because there's been a movement for board of directors, and it's very odd. You can kind of peel back the onion here, but it has to do with dairy, which I don't think a lot of people would necessarily know. But there's a case where an ice cream manufacturer actually had basically introduced listeria into the dairy manufacturing of their ice cream. And yada, yada, yada. The long and short of it was the board of directors chose not to fund basically basically they were presented with options and said, no, we're not going to worry about that. People ended up dying or being seriously ill. Those people ended up actually getting, the board of directors actually became personally liable in a class action lawsuit because it was found they didn't do their due diligence for safety of the consumers. Now, what this did was set precedents, and people have argued that it is applicable to cybersecurity for things like ransomware, i.e., if a hospital, a publicly traded or private organization of a hospital, the board of directors, actually did not fund cybersecurity or chose not to take it serious, if they didn't do their due diligence, that these board of directors could now be arguably prosecuted or at least gone after their personal assets. So now we're seeing things like subcommittees being stood up on ransomware and these functions that I had one CISO kind of say, like, my board of director cares about what they see on Fox News or MSNBC. They don't care about anything else. They just care if they might have to deal with it in court. So do you find that as a CISO or someone advising CISOs, do you find that they're having to do as much education up around cybersecurity threats as they are actually defending or talking about the, as you said earlier, the metrics of success for the organization? Are you finding you're educating people in this realm, or, as you said, is this a vertical specific problem that you haven't dealt with?
Well, I think education is occurring across the board, and probably, as a leader, regardless, if you have a C and you want to be a big C, a lot of your education is to your peers horizontally, to those stakeholders, and a lot of your time needs to be spent going up the chain of command. And hopefully, you have a good deputy in a role that can help with the operational things, because really, I think you should be working sideways and up there for sure, because there's education. There's a lot of nuance. I mean, you and I could have a very nuanced discussion around some of these topics in ransomware in particular and initial access. But for the layman, the journeyman that's out there, they're not going to know the nuance there. So I think it's really important. Threat modeling is not necessarily the word I would use when communicating up, but there's a lot of people don't understand the threats. You mentioned the Fox News as an example. It's like, oh my God, this China is targeting this sector, blah, blah, blah. It may not be applicable to you at all. Your biggest threat might actually be commodity ransomware. So I do think there is a bit of education up on these are the types of threats that might go after our type of business, so that maybe you have less headline chasing and it makes some of your communication easier. Because it's not a fun place to be. And I've been at this in multiple times in my career, chasing the headlines is not a good spot to be. So I think regardless of the sector that you're in, there's education up the chain that you need to be doing, if nothing else, to give them confidence. Again, like, hey, we have a governance, we have a program, we're adhering to it. You can feel rested, or you can feel rest assured that we do have something in place to try to combat and minimize the implications of ransomware. Of course, there's no silver bullet. We could still do all the right things. We could still have our cyber insurance policy, and we could still be compromised by it. So I think you're always going to be in a constant communication, up and sideways.
You hit on a couple things that we're going to touch on, or I'd like to kind of touch on, but one of which is cybersecurity insurance. So, one of my colleagues, Kirsty Payne, and I have been doing some research, and that's going to be released later on in October, September, October. But one of the things we found was people's almost hesitance towards the efficacy of cybersecurity insurance. I'm curious what your thoughts are. No pros, no cons, there are no negatives or positives here, just more or victim blaming perhaps. But do you see value going forward with this? Is it too excessive? Is it one of those things that nice to have, but you can't afford it? Not
It's a
your company
great,
personally, but like just overall,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and actually, cyber insurance was a big topic in Black Hat, last month, this month. And I've renewed cyber insurance policies, and I've seen premiums go up on them. I think you have to go in first of all with a couple perspectives. One is if you're hoping that cyber insurance is going to help you with the potential exposure of your intellectual property, I think that's a wrong approach. I think you need to think of cyber insurance as something that could help with your outreach and your crisis communication and bringing in CrowdStrike, bringing in Mandiant to do the work. Like there is a piece there, but I don't think you can just transfer the risk to the insurance policy and think that your brand or intellectual property will be safe. So I think that's one. I do think there is a place for it. Actually, one of my former colleagues, Heidi Shea from Forrester, she just published some new research on the state of cyber insurance that I was looking at earlier this week, which it's interesting. And she was the stats that they had in Forrester was talking about was actually those that had cyber insurance were less likely to suffer significant breaches, which I wanted to dig into a little bit more. But one of the
Yeah, it seems like there might be some correlation causation there, right? Like the people who, to take the firm formerly attributed to Rick Holland of Security Poverty Line,
Mhm.
if you can afford to have a nicety like cyber insurance, are you also the ones who are probably thinking longer term or have better network defenses to start with?
Mm-hmm. So I don't know this 100%, but things I do know, cyber insurance policies require EDR as an example, right? You got to be this tall, security
Sure.
poverty line, this tall to ride. So I think that's a good thing. Also we'll have things around multi-factor authentication, which we all know is a good thing, but you could also just completely have a checkbox on it. You may only have one system rolled out for MFA and it's not global. So
Right.
I don't think cyber insurance is a panacea. If you are a B2B company, cyber insurance is going to be a requirement from your customers, right? So it may just be you have to have a cyber insurance policy if you want to be able to sell to certain segments of the market and things along those lines. So I think it is something that is in the suite, the arsenal of a CISO. I don't think it's a panacea. I think could have exposure beyond what the policy could cover. And the other is because I think some of the underwriting, I feel high confidence in saying a lot of the insurance companies have underwritten policies where they're taking on a lot of risk. There's been a lot more, I'll use rigor in quotes, more rigor in these policies and underwriting probably in the past 18 months than you've seen in the past 6 years. So there's a lot of policies that have risk. That's why the premiums are going up so much. So I think it's something that you should consider having, but it's not going to save the day for you.
It's not going to save the day. Speaking of things that might save the day, we were talking about this before the interview, but generative AI. It's been something that's been very divisive. It's probably the other hottest subject at Black Hat this year. I think just about every talk either was on generative AI or referenced it one way or the other. And as I said, Kirsty and I have been looking at some research coming back from CISOs, and opinions really seem split. People seem absolutely terrified of generative AI and what it means, and they're positive that adversaries are going to have a huge uplift. And then simultaneously, they have fully adopted it, and stunning amounts are using it in one way or the other. So I'm curious not necessarily from the nuts and bolts side of the view, which neither of us are necessarily qualified to talk about, but more from the application of it in an organization. I'm curious, Rick, to start with. My first question is really, what's your gut feeling? Is this going to be a net positive for the cybersecurity community, or net negative, or a wash?
I think it'll be a net positive, but it's new technology, and we need to treat it like we would. I don't know that we do the best job of identifying and treating risk of new technology. If you're just talking about insurance and risk treatment, I think AI is another one. And also from the sidelines, just like we did with blockchain, we love to kind of talk smack about emerging technology and things like that. Although I would argue that I feel like AI has already demonstrated more applications
Yeah,
than blockchain
I feel good
has.
on this one. Yeah, I'm okay continuing to throw blockchain under the bus. Sorry, blockchain folks.
Yeah, no offense, crypto companies that are being targeted by Lazarus Group in North Korea. Um, that's a side project there, and be in your threat model if you're in financial services or in the crypto industry.
Yeah.
So, what I'm seeing on the AI front is it's just it's we're so early. I see so many organizations that haven't made yet a decision to block it or permit it, are really even in the early stages of setting up their risk assessments of the technology that's out there. I mentioned governance and for the board, right? Well, establishing what the governance is going to be. How are we going to decide what we do with AI? Do we run our own models? Do we use the external models? Do we allow agents? What type of agents do we use? We're very much in the early days, but I think overall it's going to be a net positive for cybersecurity. Seems like it's the only thing that can get funded right now when it comes to venture investing, with some of that money that's sat on the sidelines as well. But overall, I think it's going to be a net positive.
You brought up something that I've had a lot of questions from customers of Splunk, and then just overall something I was hearing at Black Hat was really, how do you defend against ChatGPT? And my answer has always been, how do you defend against your engineer uploading into VirusTotal or uploading into Box, right? Like for me personally, it's an exciting, sexy new technology, but if your concern is my people are going to put proprietary information into someone else's cloud, doesn't really matter if it's ChatGPT. It's just more, how are you preventing this material from leaving your organization? For your point of view, what are some of the threats or concerns that you've heard CISOs talk about regarding the use of generative AI?
Well, one of them is definitely, I mean, probably the most significant is the data exposure, particularly if in someone in a regulated space. So if somebody puts EU citizen data, and now I've got to talk to a commissioner's office for a violation of citizen private data there. So DLP exposure is probably the main one that I see. Also related to that could be, I'm concerned about the third parties doing this as well. So a third party that has access to my information is doing this. Now I have another avenue for third party exposure. So I would say by and large, that is the largest one. I don't see the CISOs talking about how adversaries are going to need to use AI. And I would argue that the success rate that threat actors have, sure, they could use AI to optimize their operations, but they don't need, magic AI to compromise, to gain initial access into environments. That's for sure.
I always say it's like if you have a nugget of gold that has a little bit of dirt on it and you polish off the dirt, you always had a nugget of gold, right? Like there's no, like, great, spearphishing got slightly better with AI, but it was already the number one ingress for like 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that one interesting. The other, Rick and I, we both come from government backgrounds, and something we had to deal with in our day-to-day life was data spillage. When you had classified information leave a classified network and somehow get into unclassified, it's called spillage. And you have to do a lot of work around making sure it's cleaned up, making sure emails are deleted, making sure hard drives are formatted. But one of the things I was talking about with a data science friend of mine around LLMs, he's like, we don't even really understand all the inferments that a LLM, a large language model, might have from data. And so when you start talking about EU citizen data entering into an LLM in a spillage, or God forbid, classified data into a spillage, there isn't really a recovery because it's no longer actual data, it's ones and zeros, it's inferment. And now you have something that is going to make decisions based off of this body of knowledge that it's inferring from. And so one of the things you were talking about was, to your point about governance, like the US government or organizations have no clue how to deal with this. How do you go back to someone and say, yes, we categorically believe and know that any reference or inferments from your data are no longer present in this generative AI system? And the answer is, I don't think anyone can say that. And that's stunning to me, because there is no, that's, once you've polluted the lake, there is no cleaning it. It's the lake has the pollution, the data lake, if you will.
Yeah, that's why some of the companies that have just straight up blocked it while they figure out their governance, is not a bad strategy. The thing I worry about there is just shadow AI, like what's going to keep someone from copying, pasting in there. Yeah. But I think you've got to do a discovery, like you think practical things. I mean, you can use your DNS logs, your web proxy logs. You can see the services that people are going out to get an inventory of the types of things that are being used. People are going to find a way. Shadow IT, shadow AI is going to happen. You're not going to be able to stop it. So this, if you do go the block route, I would say set up your governance. If you're going to roll your own models, which a lot of organizations are, they want to roll their own in either in a private cloud or they're going to host it on-prem. That's a route that you can go. There, I'd be worried about the agents that you have plugging in to go get more.
Well, and is roll your own LLM going to be the new roll your own crypto in 2 years? Right? Is this the one of the things I was talking to some customers at RSA this year, where generative AI kind of had its like, OpenAI came out, and then a month later was RSA, so everyone was talking about it, but no one had anything to do with it yet. But one of the customers I talked to, they said we had this great governance policy. We had OpenAI blocked almost immediately at the web proxy. Like, we were pretty happy with what we were doing. And then somebody said, oh, what about API calls? And they found out like that was not covered by their block, and that their developers had actually been doing over 1 million queries a month into the API. And it was actually making business decisions for them that they had no clue about. And they said, yeah, and that's just the generative AI client that we knew about, because there were 20 others that we then found out in our discovery process. And I was like, yeah, one CISO described it to me as trying to put water back uphill. Like, you just can't, you can make all the finger bridges you want, but the water's going to seep over or around or through. It's going to happen. We talk about AI a lot on this show because it is a fascinating new realm, but it's also, it's hard for people to wrap their head around, and I don't think anyone has a great answer yet.
Well, definitely got to do the discovery, to your point. Figure out your governance and figure out a way to use it, because it's going to be used one way or another. Either your competitors are going to use it to competitive advantage over you, or the shadow AI, shadow IT use cases.
So we're getting pretty close to the end, and something I wanted to talk to you about, Rick, that came up with one of the mentors or mentees that I have, is they wanted me to ask you specifically about your choice to go from a world-leading individual contributor in terms of threat intelligence, and kind of making that decision to go into leadership, into more of an executive role. And one of the things I talked to them about was, something I learned in the military, I'm sure you did as well, is you can be a leader and you can be a manager, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And you can be a leader who's an IC, and you can be a manager who is not a leader. But for your journey or your choices, like, what made you have that decision to kind of jump over the fence into an executive role? And what are your thoughts around it?
For me, it was about building. At Forrester, I was telling people how to build, be it a vendor or a Fortune 100 company, where I was giving suggestions on how to approach it, but I had never done it before. So I wanted to come to a startup and build. And then as I was helping build Digital Shadows out before we ultimately got acquired by ReliaQuest, I had opportunities to lead functional areas within the organization. We created the CISO role. I rebuilt the intelligence team that was out there. So I am motivated by building teams, building companies, and helping build individuals. Like, I really do like helping people grow their careers. And if you look at some of the alumni in particular from Digital Shadows, they've gone on to do some really great, impressive things. So I get a lot of passion out of just building, and just in general, I like that versus maybe the farming example.
Fair enough. And Rick, you've given me a lot of growth over the years as well, something I've been very appreciative of, a lot of chances in the SANS CTI community, and I'm partly here where I am because of you. So as always, we thank you.
I'm sorry. Audio went out there for a second.
I know, it's weird, right? You don't normally hear. That's it. You're only going to get it once, Rick. After that, we're back to subtle insults and teardowns. So, what a great way to end, with a positive note for once, with Mr. Rick Holland. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Rick, thank you for making the time. Sorry I don't have brisket for you, but I'll make sure to get some for you next time we're together. And for everyone else watching, we'll be back next Tuesday for our regular scheduled Mick Baccio, myself, Audra Streetman, talking about the news. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Take care.